and I am Jane Hershey. I am the Executive Director of CitySprouts, and I am very happy to welcome you to the second session of our series in our very first year. The topic is garden writing and publishing in the garden. These CitySprouts webinars are showcasing the garden-based lessons and activities that the Cambridge and Boston teachers in our network are doing in their school gardens. And they're intended to be the foundation for a community of practice of teachers invested in making the garden part of their students' learning and part of the school's culture as well. So I know we've got teachers on the line. I know we also have many other educators, garden educators and general educators, and some food advocates and garden advocates in the community. So it's a great mix of people, all who share that goal of making garden-based learning part of every child's life. We hope that the lesson that you see today on using the garden for student writing will spark your own stories, questions, comments about integrating the garden with a lesson outside or bringing the garden into the classroom, both of which are garden-based learning. So please consider this an invitation to start more conversations. My name is Jane Hershey. There I am. And as I said, I'm the Executive Director of CitySprouts, and we are the school garden program for this network of 16 schools in Cambridge and Boston. We have been partnering with Cambridge Public Schools for the past 15 years, and more recently added 4 Boston Public School partnerships. And our vision is to build school capacity to really integrate edible gardens as an instructional resource for teachers. And of course, behind that is with the children, as a way to connect young people to nature and food systems where they live and learn. So I'd like to give you just a few reminders about our webinar platform today. We are recording today's session, and the recording will be posted on our website. And you can find this session and all previous sessions on the teacher forum page of citysprouts.org. If you've noticed it's kind of quiet here except for my voice, it's because everyone's audio has been muted to limit background noise. A hard decision for us to make because we really wanted to encourage your questions and comments. So I am asking all of you who are here to do as I've done and as Erin did down in the corner of the chat box. Please introduce yourself. Let us know who you are. We see your names under the participant list, and we're curious about where you come from. And of course, we want to hear your questions and comments about the forum today. So I'm going to be your voice. I will be taking note of the questions down there and making sure that they get repeated when we get to after the presentation. So turn off your video and use that chat box, and we will begin. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce the speakers here today. Our subject is using the school garden to spark and support student writing. We're featuring the Graham and Parks Elementary School community, specifically 2 teachers, Linnea Adams and Fabrizia Edang, 2 third-grade teachers who've developed a writing unit for their students that really springboards from the garden. We'll also hear from Michelle Kaufman, our CitySprouts garden coordinator at the Graham and Parks, and lastly from Liz McNerney, Graham and Parks parent and garden advocate extraordinaire, who will tell us the story of how the school garden at the Graham and Parks was built. So remember to use that chat box, and without any further ado, I will hand it over to Liz.
Yes, hello. I'm hoping that I am coming through to people. Yes, I'm getting nods. That's terrific. So yes, my name is Liz McNerney. I am a former parent here at Graham and Parks. I had 3 children who worked through the one who worked through the Graham and Parks K-8 and 2 who worked through the Graham and Parks K-5 programs. And we built this garden in 2008. This building had been the Peabody Elementary School, and it was, you know, a terrific new structure with this amazing courtyard for garden and growing space. It was a landscaped space upon kind of initial conception and was professionally maintained for a time. It contained some unusual plants and some interesting hardscapes in the fact that it had big round pads, one of which turned into a floor map of the world and things like that. So we wanted to try to stay true to some of those architectural interests as we took over this really central piece of our school to turn it into a classroom extension in many ways, as well as a feature for our community to use in various ways, which I'll talk more about as we go. So we are now, the Graham Parks Alternative Public School is in this building, and as an alternative public school, we are fond of having a specific identity, and there were many, many teachers who were really enthusiastic about the transformation that occurred in the central courtyard, and they stood back and they said, this makes this our school, as we hauled in all of these crazy blocks. And we had a serendipitous situation where there were masons available through the incredible generosity of a local contractor who did not have any particular affiliation with the school, but was really just willing to pitch in and loan his people and his trucks and all kinds of things. And so that in conjunction with a bunch of parents, we did have to move every one of those blocks that you see there from the front walk into the courtyard. And the kids saw it and the teachers watched it, and everybody said, wow, those people care about this space in ways that really felt super tangible for the community. Once the beds were built, the kids took it seriously and decided that a bed was for lying down in. And they made their marks on the inside of all those blocks, and then we kept filling it in with dirt. CitySprouts, of course, has some pretty high standards about what they're willing to grow their stuff in. So we had to bring in some soil because it was urban soil here. And we did that with the help of all kinds of parents again. And eventually we were able to plant up these gorgeous curvilinear beds so that this space could fill all of the various roles in our school. I'm losing my audio. I'm hoping other people aren't. Mike, I'm getting an echo, but so it is, as I mentioned, it is symbolic because it's a big change in what was a new building at the time. And it is clear when you've got adults and kids out there sweeping up and picking up that people notice. And Graham Parks is developing a school culture around CARES, CARES, and that stands for specific things. Each of those letters stands for something specific. But taking care is also something that the whole school wants to emphasize. And the garden is one way that everybody can participate in doing that. We do certainly, have every intention of supporting curricular aspects, and then our community uses the space both just as a beautiful space as well as a real educational space. And it does turn into, the garden itself turns into an additional piece of many of our community celebrations, so that when a particular grade level is having an end of unit something, we can have something in the garden that parents can also walk through and see how those connections can be made. When we have our school book fair, which is in June, there's always a family evening, and one of the things we do in the garden is kids will illustrate stories, and then they can take their parents on a story walk around one of the garden beds and, again, bring just appreciation for the garden at the very least into everyone's purview. And one of the main things that I'm involved in at our garden is this idea of a drop-in. And a drop-in is an informal opportunity for kids to come with their parents or their caregivers and just spend a little time in the garden. And it's a really interesting time because one of the things that I keep hearing in conversation with teachers, and I would guess that all of those of you who are teachers share this kind of thing, is that your days are so packed and so scheduled, and your kids have to be on and moving and going so much of the time that being able to drop in the afternoon and really just kind of look around and take a breath and decide if you're going to sweep or you're going to dig or you're going to plant or you're going to draw is this really interesting kind of moment. And it's something that, you know, we're hoping to preserve. Within that, we do hope to get some specific things done, and so we try to support our garden coordinator and all of the garden spaces with some of the basic maintenance during that time. And as much as, you know, you hear that kids don't really care if they help out at home, many of them are really willing to help out in the garden. So we do get some sweeping and some raking and all that good stuff done. And then, of course, there's harvesting. So it is something that we're trying to turn into a wider community kind of activity, as it says there, including plant care workshops for adults. We have great resources in our area, and I think a lot of places do in terms of having extension schools and agricultural access where you can get experts. And we had an expert from the Harvard University Herbarium who came over and did a perennials identification and dividing and care workshop last fall. So these are the kinds of things that we're hoping to get everybody more comfortable in the garden, more engaged in the garden, and feeling, you know, confident and as though it's important.
This is Fabrizia. Can you switch to Linnea, please?
Hello?
Now you're on Michelle. Oh, no, now you're on Eric.
Okay. All right. So my name is Linnea Adams, and my partner teacher is Fabrizia Adang. We're third grade teachers at the Graham Parks Elementary School in Cambridge, and we started this project because we were looking for a culmination for our science unit on plants, as well as a way to incorporate informational writing. We tie it also to our reading unit on informational text, and we're looking for, let's start again. So we started this project to end our science unit on plants and incorporate some informational writing. We really wanted to have an outside audience so that the students' work would have people see it beyond just our classroom, to go out into the community somehow and increase their motivation through their writing. So what we decided to do was create some informational placards for our garden. The students did research on different plants that were growing in our garden and wrote paragraphs about how the plants grow and how to eat plants. We had a visit from a professional botanical illustrator to learn how to create our own high-quality drawings of the plants. And in the end, we combined the paragraphs and the drawings onto one page on the computer to create a laminated placard for the garden. And you can see one of the examples here, which is about turnips. So 2 paragraphs and a beautiful drawing about turnips. So to do this activity, the kind of overview is that the students each chose a plant that interested them. We tapped into our garden coordinator to find out about the plants in our garden and increase their motivation by letting them have some choice rather than just assigning plants. We let them have a little say about what plants were interesting to them. They wrote the informational paragraphs after doing research, and we had our professional botanical illustrator was a 5th grade teacher in our school. Her previous job had been botanical illustration, so she was a great resource that we were able to tap into. If you don't know botanical illustrator, certainly an art teacher might be a really good resource. We came up with the following learning targets that we wanted the students to learn and be able to do by the end of our project. So they could find information about a plant that interests them, take notes on that plant, use the notes to create paragraphs, have a clear topic sentence and lots of relevant details, and a concluding sentence for each paragraph. We go through a regular revision cycle where they revise their writing with peer feedback. They edit their own work using an editing checklist with help from adults, and they also needed to draw a high-quality botanical illustration. Now it's time for Fabrizia.
Oh, okay. Hi, this is Fabrizia. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got kids to that final product that you saw at the beginning. So we started by conceptualizing what the model would look like. We created a teacher model of a placard so kids could see where we were going in the end. After that, we went through the garden with Michelle and created a list of the plants that were there or plants that could be planted in the spring. And we came up with a brief description of the plants with photographs so that we could introduce the plants to students and they could figure out what they would be most interested in learning more about and ultimately writing a placard about. That was based on what was in the garden, but we also thought about materials that were available for students to research. And so we went through both our classroom libraries and our school libraries and the public library to really make sure we had information about all of the plants. Then we created a graphic organizer for students to take notes on once they had identified the plants that they were interested in researching about, and we taught them how to take notes using that graphic organizer. We had another graphic organizer that we used for taking the notes and planning the paragraphs that they would write. After that, when they wrote their final product, we had the lesson with the botanical illustrator, and then we provided them the materials that they needed to illustrate their plants. So some plants they could see in the garden, others we had to go into books to find a picture or a photograph of, or some of them we had to research on the computer and use a picture from the computer to draw from. So kids drew their botanical illustrations on just white drawing paper, and we decided to use regular pencils, but you might also be interested in using colored pencils. At the end, we scanned the pictures into the computer in the computer lab, so you needed to have a scanner, and then we chose to laminate the placards because we know they'll be going out into the garden and we want them to be weatherproof. Michelle helped us by providing us names for the plants in the garden or plants that we could grow, and she was also the one who gave us a brief description of the plants, and she gave a photograph, or she showed a photograph of the plant to introduce students to what was available in the garden. Students loved this project, so they were very motivated to do their best work because they knew that they had an authentic audience, that visitors to the garden would see their work, that it wouldn't just be within their classroom, that their parents would see it, that other visitors to Grandman Park would see it. They also felt a real sense of ownership for the plants that they researched, even though some of them weren't familiar with the plants in the beginning. And a lot of kids were excited about trying the plants. So one of my students and several of the students in Linnеa's class asked their parents to prepare the plants for them to eat at home. adults also loved the project. So the parents in our classroom and our colleagues were really impressed with the quality of the students' written work and their botanical illustrations. And a lot of people are very excited to see the placards when they go into the garden in the spring. I think I'm going to turn it over to Michelle now. I'm still doing, okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about teacher tips. Sorry for that. So this is a really great project for kids to apply what they had learned in science and writing. Oh, there we go. Excellent. It was a fantastic project. One big thing to consider is the resources that are available. So we thought about the plants first and then looked for the resources after. We suggest finding the resources first and then offering the plant choices. It was hard to find sources for some of the plants. So for some things like carrots and carrots and potatoes and beans, that was pretty simple. But then we also had kids researching kale, parsley, turnips, and it was harder to find kid-appropriate resources about those plants. It also could be a place, though, where you offer a nice opportunity for differentiation. So for our kids that were stronger readers, we were able to give them sources that were written for adults. So we used a gardening book for some of the plants. Some kids did research on the internet. So you could choose the plants based on the sources that are available, or you might consider just using that as a place to differentiate for the reading levels within your classroom. Another thing to consider was the botanical illustration. So kids that had OT issues needed more support with the illustration, and that could be a great place to bring in your OT and have him or her support the student in their drawing. We really appreciated having a botanical illustrator come in, but you could use any art expert, whether it's an art teacher or a parent in your classroom who knows a lot about drawing or illustration. Our botanical illustrator recommended making the illustrations as big as possible, so we used we encouraged kids to draw their illustration on the entire sheet of paper so that then when we scan them into the computer, they were more detailed when they were smaller on the plant placard. We did our project in the spring. I'm sorry, we did our project in the fall, but it would also be a great project to do in the spring. Everything. Oh, and then lastly, we had focused on informational writing, but you could also change the focus to persuasive writing if you were interested in tying it into a persuasive writing unit to encourage people or to persuade people why certain plants would be a good choice for the school garden. Thanks, and I'm going to turn it over to Michelle now.
So hi, my name is Michelle Kaufman, and I'm the garden coordinator for Raymond Parks, along with 3 other schools. So just a little bit of background about the garden and what we have planted there. Something that's really special about this garden is that it's in a large courtyard. And so as students are going between class and the cafeteria and that sort of thing, they can walk outside through the garden, which allows them to interact with it more than they would if it was just outside of the school. So in the garden, we try to have some plants that are planted that kids are really familiar with, and some that they might not have experienced or seen before. So some familiar vegetables that kids can relate to and they'd be really happy to try and taste are tomatoes or carrots or lettuce and things that they are more likely to have had at home, and some of the less familiar vegetables like eggplant and Swiss chard and okra and ground cherries, so that they can learn about new fruits and vegetables that they might want to try. And in general, tasting is a huge thing that students really love to do in the garden. So having a big herb garden is really great since they can grow easily in large quantities and whole classes can taste a bunch of different herbs. So that's a really interactive way for them to use the garden as well. We have perennials that are planted that are great for lessons about perennials and pollination lessons, and they help keep the soil healthy throughout the winter as well. And this garden, a couple special aspects of it. One are that there are a bunch of trees in the courtyard as well, and so those kind of add another aspect so that you're not only looking at this growing food, but what trees can be useful for and obviously show clear signs of changing colors in the fall and spring and summer. So we used that for a photosynthesis lesson. And in the garden, we also have a cherry tree planted that students voted on a year ago. And so something that is special about Graham Parks is every year the students get to vote on a new tree or native plant that they want to plant in the garden. So this coming spring, they voted on a plum tree, so that will be planted there as well. And that kind of gives students ownership over the garden and makes them feel like they're having a say in it, and it's not just, you know, this thing that already exists without them. So in terms of how teachers are using the garden at Graham Parks, there's a big diversity based on the needs of the teacher and the needs of the students and the age of the class. So kind of two big ways are that some teachers use the garden to solidify or like create a hands-on outside lesson of something they're already learned in class. So that might be an example where a class learns about different colors and then they come outside to the garden and do a color scavenger hunt. Or they learn about the different parts of a plant in class in a book or something, and then they come outside and they can look at the plants outside and kind of put everything they've learned in the classroom into practice. And the alternative is using some time or a lesson in the garden as a launching pad or starting point for another lesson. So that might be, this is often a lot more useful for younger grades where they can come out to the garden and kind of just have some general exploration time or dig or just do some activities without clear direction about what they're doing. And then when they return to the class, it makes it really easy for the teacher to have a conversation with them about the shared experience they've had and go into a lesson from there without kind of loading them with information before they've gone out to the garden. And then specifically with my work with Linnea and Fabrizia, it was a really great kind of setup because Linnea and Fabrizia were very planned from the beginning of the school year. So we kind of met the first couple weeks of school and picked, talked about what their overall goals were for the garden and for their lesson, and we picked 3 dates ahead of time where their class would come out into the garden for specific lessons. So we did a lesson on bees and pollination, and we did a lesson on the changes in the fall and why leaves change color and photosynthesis. And having that, knowing the topics that they wanted to cover in advance made it really helpful to do the specific lessons with that bigger picture in mind, so you can kind of keep referring back knowing what the end goal is to understand how plants work. And so, yeah, we kind of collaborated. The teacher had the idea for, or knew what the lessons were going to be, what the topics they wanted to cover were, and then we both kind of came to the table with a couple different ideas. You know, here's a book that might be great, and here's an activity that I know of, and we collaborated to create what those lessons would be in the garden. And then, as Linnea had said, I visited the classroom when they were starting their kind of big culminating project, and we opened up Google Images and searched for every single plant that we had in the garden or that we would be planting this spring so that the students could see them and put an image to it and ask questions about certain vegetables that they might be interested in. And then, yeah, I think that the placards were really, really great for the students to have a sort of taking ownership of a part of the garden and feeling like they are making a real mark in it, and it's something that is going to be used by other students. And also I think other classes might see those placards and think that they would like to get involved in some other way in the garden, seeing all this other work that their classmates are doing. So that's all that I have.
Okay. So thank you all so much. That was really interesting, and I think these drawings that the kids did are just amazing. We've got some questions down from the chat box, and a lot of them have to do with those drawings. So maybe I'll just start with that. So Linnea and Fabrizia, we've got some questions about just the drawing skill of making those amazing botanical drawings. Can you tell us a little bit about that process? Someone wanted to know how much time you spent focusing on that, and I'm interested in just how did you work on the drawing part of the lesson?
Well, as we said, we brought in our 5th grade teacher, Rose Levine, who had been a botanical illustrator in her previous job, and she kind of came and gave an introductory lesson on botanical drawing. She brought her own sketchbooks and just showed the kids what was possible. She gave them some activities to do, some little drawing exercises to get their observational skills flowing. And the main piece of advice she gave them was to look at the object you're drawing, not at your paper. Not that you never look at your paper, but you should spend more time thinking about what that object really looks like, what you're really seeing, rather than what you think a leaf looks like or you think a tomato looks like. So she gave that initial lesson, and we had some plant materials in the classroom, kind of dried flowers, pine cones, acorns, plant things for them to look at, and they tried out that process of really looking at the object rather than what they thought it should look like. And then after that, the drawings were kind of the activity the kids did when they weren't writing. So whenever they had time between drafts or while they were waiting for a peer critique or anything like that, they would pull them out and start working on those. And at our school, we have a real focus on revision and putting in lots of work, aiming high, getting feedback, and doing multiple drafts. So we just kind of kept talking about that, encouraging the kids to do, try it out, try again, what would you change? But it was pretty independent for them. Some kids did 1 or 2 drafts. One of my students probably did 9 drafts with his summer squash and was really proud of that summer squash at the end. Every time he did a new draft, he felt so much better. So that's such a great message for kids, too, about the hard work, and that revision really makes such a difference, that your first effort is not going to be the one that you probably want to put out there. Do you want to add anything, Patricia?
No, I think you covered it, Linnea. The one thing I was going to say was that it really depended on the child. The girl who did the turn-up took that home with her. She was so invested in it and was so careful to attend to the detail. But I had another student who looked at his on the computer once I had scanned it in, and he said, oh, I want to take that back again, and I want to do an even better job on it. So it was really up to each individual child how much time they spent on it, but overall I would say my class was very invested in making it their most beautiful work possible, especially knowing that it would go out in the garden and that people would be seeing it.
I agree.
That's really, yeah, very interesting to hear you talk about the drawing as being such a significant part of this lesson. I know that drawing is such so much more than art, and can often be a window into inquiry and a kind of a close observation that has a lot to do with other subjects besides art. And it's interesting that you as teachers invested so much in that, and it sounds like your students is also really invested in in just that skill of drawing. That's really interesting. We have another question here about the kid-appropriate resources. Could you recommend some of those? We heard that it was a little difficult to find resources for things like kale compared to things like carrots. Could you share with us some of the places where you did find good kid-appropriate resources for the plants and the vegetables?
There was one series from the public library that was very accessible to 3rd graders in terms of reading level and had a variety of plants, but it didn't have the more unique plants. So for things like kale, we did have to turn more to adult sources, and depending on the child, we did do some scaffolding. So for one student who I have that's an English language learner who was researching, I believe it was, I don't remember at this moment, but the source was challenging for her to read independently, but when she and I read it together, she was able to comprehend what it was about and take notes on it. So depending on the child, we did provide some additional scaffolding too. But I don't know if you have other suggestions about the sources.
Picture books for kids were really good. I think it also depends on what your writing focus is. If you were going to write more persuasively, you could do less with research and more about experience, like having the kids eat it. Or another resource we actually used was cookbooks. We used a lot of cookbooks to come up with ways to eat the plant, because we call our unit eat food, mostly plants. And so we were encouraging the kids to be eating the plants and trying the plants. So cookbooks were helpful. Kid-friendly cookbooks were good. I don't think we have really great recommendations because it was pretty challenging to find. And you can also think how much you want your kids to be looking online or not. A lot of the things online were for adults. One of our more exotic plants was black emerweed, which had already been planted in the garden, and a kid was really excited to write about it. But the only resources we could find for black emerweed were adult, descriptions of it. But this is where we did some differentiation, and he was certainly someone who could read those and get a lot out of them. And he ended up wanting to write a whole other paragraph about the history of this ancient grain. So that's another place for differentiation, that you can have kids write additional paragraphs if they're interested.
Thank you.
Sorry for books.
So I'm going to have a question here for Liz about that community. And that is just, you talked about the garden being an additional element, a living example of the value of the garden for the neighbors and the families who come. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I can certainly try. Again, it's really a demonstration piece, and so we try to have our parents around when kids are around, and there are many, many classrooms that look down onto the garden. I mean, it really is a special courtyard kind of thing. So we feel that there are people out there who spend their time caring for it and making it ready for the day. The larger community has really only taken place a couple of times where we flyered neighbors and stuff and invited them when we were having an event. And it's like the family night or the fair or the management ceremony, and we close the garden down in October, November, even November. As an opportunity for people to
Okay. Yeah, Liz, it's a little bit hard to hear you, but I'm going to repeat some of the things you said so that other people get that too. And you're talking about just how visible the garden is in the school. There are classes, as a courtyard garden, there are classes that are looking down on it and what an impact that makes. And then some of the efforts that the Graham Parks community did, families, and I'm imagining teachers too, to fly their neighbors and let them know about things that were happening in the garden or invite them in.
and there was never a huge influx of people that came, but there were a few, and they were really interested community people who wanted to know what's going on in schools. And having the opportunity to come in and see it. So this is always nice when taxpayers feel good about what's going on.
And that's a real boon for schools too, to be able to have neighbors who start to understand what's happening in schools, to be interested and curious and invested in what's happening in a school in their neighborhood, maybe especially if they don't have children there.
Right.
Yeah. And then Lene, or maybe it was Fabrizia, talked about an example of a student doing a story walk in the garden at the school's annual book publishing event. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Liz had actually spoken about that, so maybe she could.
Oh, that was Liz. Okay,
yeah, that had been
great.
Liz talking about how the community is involved in the garden.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was the book fair, which is an annual fundraiser that our library does, and they set up in the lobby, and the lobby flows right into the garden. So we were looking at something in the garden for family evening, and we worked with some of the younger grades to illustrate an Eric Carle book, Dr. Ladybug, and we have done a couple others, but the Dr. Ladybug stands out in my mind right now. And we simply placed pages around one of the beds and then the kids could walk families around. The text was strictly Eric Carl, and the illustrations were strictly Grant Person. It was just a way to walk around and while you were admiring an illustration, have an opportunity to look a little more closely at a plant.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you all so much for this presentation. This is really great to... Liz?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, hi. I'm not sure I missed something that you were about to say.
We were just...
Okay.
I don't know which one I thought. Okay. So we were talking about the ways the community uses the garden, which is actually harvesting food, and teachers who are around at the end of a drop-in, for instance, will often walk home with a pint of cherry tomatoes and a bunch of beans, and people also harvest the chard and the parsley and the basil and have something fresh in their garden. It is also used in the cafeteria, but it's not like a significant portion of the food the kids eat, really.
So you're saying that sometimes the food is harvested and goes to the school cafeteria? Is that what you said?
Sure, it does. Yeah. And the cooks will come out and see if there's anything that they can, as a garnish or as a whatever, add to what they're serving that day.
Yeah, I know this is not true for every school district, but that's really amazing that there's so much back and forth movement between the school cafeteria and the garden. And that must be really interesting.
The garden too.
And it opens onto, yeah. So it feels like everything opens onto your school garden. And that's really amazing. Yeah. Okay. Well, I wanted to thank you all very much for this presentation. It's been really great to hear about the story, and I think especially as the bonus, hearing about the community involvement in the garden and how much that garden is part of building the community. In fact, I feel I'm hearing that both in the lessons that Linnea and Fabrizia are talking about, and bringing in experts, drawing experts, garden experts, and then that garden kind of giving back to the community as well. That's a really wonderful story and a great reflection on the Graham Parks community. So I want to let everybody know who's on this call that everyone will get a certificate of participation for being on the call. And if you are a Cambridge Public School teacher or a Boston Public School teacher, you can additionally get district credit for being part of this webinar. And those portals are on the CitySprouts website. And if you have any questions, you should email or give us a call. So I want to once again thank our, I'm going to move back just one slide here. Once again, thank our presenting educators today, Liz, Linnea, Fabrizia, and Michelle, and thank everybody who is on the call. All of this, the information and the resources that Fabrizia and Linnea talked about, we can post on our website, and we hope that they are useful to you as you move forward in your garden-based learning ventures. So in 2 weeks' time, we will have our next CitySprouts Teachers Forum on restorative gardening at the King Open School. And I invite you all back then in 2 weeks for that forum. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the slow spring, which is creeping into our greater Boston world here. So thanks again to you teachers. Happy gardening, and look forward to hearing more about how the garden is reaching children, and children are taking care of our gardens. Goodbye.